Have all of you here tonight. I hope we're going to have a lot of fun, I think. As we were saying, I'm a librarian, and one of the things about being a librarian is if you don't love stories, you're probably in the wrong line of work. And I love stories since I was old enough to sit at my mother's knee and listen to some very strange things. And the stranger the story, the better. I was the kind of kid who would go into my library at age 7 or 8 or 9 years old and go up to the library and be like, "Hi, you know those books that have the fairy tales that the Disney movies are about? I don't want those books. I want the book with Cinderella where she chops pieces of her feet off. Do you have one?" So I was a little weird kid. I joked that I was very much like Wednesday Addams, making a lot of Addams Family jokes tonight. And I enjoyed fairy tales and folklore and mythology just because I loved getting a sense of people. A lot of those types of stories, you get a real sense for the people that told them. And I started with all the really famous things that we all know about, but as I started to kind of collect all of these stories, I got more and more curious about the stories in my own backyard. As that sort of filters down, you go from fairy tale to folklore to legend to lore to things that start blurring a lot of lines that I'm not really sure exactly where we're going to classify them as. So this presentation I put together based on some of my favorite of those pieces of lore out of Massachusetts and why I think our state is one of the most interesting states for stories. Now I should also add that everything in this presentation has been reported by witnesses or by people that experienced them as being real experiences that they had. Now obviously this is up for much debate. There are people that absolutely believe that everything you're going to see here absolutely happened the way it was reported. There are other people that think none of this stuff happened, that it's all bunk or hoaxes or misidentified things. I'm not taking a side on any of these because, for one thing, it takes the fun out of it. I trust my audience is intelligent. I will leave it up to you to make up your own minds about what you think about these various stories. I actually have various opinions on them myself. But I also think it doesn't really matter. I think it's more a matter of finding out what the people in our state have been talking about, what kind of stories they talk about, and what kind of things they think might be dwelling around. I think that's much more important. So have fun. Definitely keep your minds open, but let's also remember to keep ourselves open to information of all kinds, and hopefully you'll make up your mind about what you think about all these things. So before we get started, the first section, I want to talk about a particular term that gets thrown around a little bit. And I'm using this just because it's an easy way to classify the first group of stories. So a lot of people refer to these types of cases as cases of cryptozoology. And basically what that means is that we're dealing with reports or stories about animals or creatures that are being reported as being possibly real, that either are not recognized whatsoever by mainstream science. They say this thing is absolutely not true, it's made up. Or it can also include animals or creatures that we know for a fact scientifically have in fact existed, but we believe no longer exist now. So some of these could fall into that category. I also want to add that if you go to Boston College and you walk in and you say, "Hi, I'm interested in science, I'd like to major in cryptozoology," they will look at you like you have 9 heads. This doesn't actually exist in real scientific studies. There is no such thing as studying cryptozoology as far as actual classifications of science go. But it's kind of a nice handle that's sort of been invented by the folks that are interested in this kind of thing. So even though it's not actually recognized by mainstream science, we're going to use the word as a catch-all just to talk about the stories we're about to look at. So the first thing we know about Massachusetts, if nothing else, is that we're a coastal state. We have huge amounts of coastline. A lot of, especially our very first settlers that came here, depended, if not completely, on fishing and shipping and other things that had to do with the sea. And when you have the sea, you have sea monsters. These things have been seen since as far back as people have been putting ships into the ocean. This is one of my favorites and one of our most famous. On August 10th of 1817, this guy, I'm going to assume it's a guy, could be a girl, but I get a guy vibe, so we'll go with it. This guy was seen in the harbor of Gloucester, Massachusetts. The really interesting thing that I like about this case is that this creature was sighted by an entire ship full of men. Some who were still actually anchored offshore in the larger ship, some of who were in small sort of dinghy boats that were rowing to shore to bring in supplies and other things, and also by some folks that were standing on shore waiting to receive some of these boats and help them move some of this material off. So we actually have 3 separate groups of witnesses from 3 very separate parts of the bay, which I find really interesting. It was reported in local papers at the time, and it was one of the biggest reports at the time. So you will see references to this in papers from Boston, from New York City, from any of the large metropolis areas that actually had papers at the time. And generally, the description was more or less the same. They described the head as being something like a turtle, but being much larger, even in fact larger than the dogs. This idea of it sort of having scales, almost like armor, and small spikes that ran down the length of the body. Interestingly enough, certain witnesses described seeing small horns on the top of the head, which we don't see in this woodcut that's based on this report, but that was debated. Not everyone reported that, so I think a lot of the folks that kind of made the woodcuts at the time decided to leave that detail off, so we're not really sure. However, as far back as this is, our Gloucester friend here is certainly not the earliest reporting of a Massachusetts sea serpent. That goes to this gentleman, the Cape Ann monster of 1693. He was sighted, again, by a crew of men who had come off of a ship. Now, the difference is that the main crew that was still on the ship did not see this. It was only several sort of dinghies full of men that were kind of rowing ashore at Cape Ann. Interestingly enough, they had picked up a couple of folks that were helping them out. They had picked them up further down the coast who were Native American, who were also in the dinghy as they were going in. When they spotted this, it was curled up around a series of rocks. At first they thought it was just another one of the boulders, and then apparently as the main dinghy got very close to it, it sat up and kind of turned its head and looked right at them, where the men panicked, realizing it was a live creature. They actually pulled weapons, and the two Native American men that were with them said, "Do not pull your weapons. Leave it alone. It'll leave us alone. If you actually hurt it, we're in trouble. It will take our boat down." So they decided not to actually attack it. This sighting is known because it was reported in a letter by John Jocelyn, who was one of the main crew members of the ship. He wrote this entire letter back to his family in England, talking about the sighting and what had happened to them. And the woodcut, particularly that was based off the letter, and the letter became so popular that, again, much like our friend in Gloucester many years later, this was reported in massive newspapers at the time, which was mostly in London, but it actually got as far as Paris, France. We know for a fact that the Parisians were talking about it. So he kind of made himself a little bit of a celebrity at the time in Europe. Interestingly enough, a few years later in Lynn, Massachusetts, something very similar to this, serpentine shape, sort of the same shape head, was also seen in the bay there. But the one thing that I find really interesting is the last sighting that was made of something that sort of fits this description. There's a slight variation in coloring, but other than that, it basically fits the same description, was off the coast of Marshfield, Massachusetts in 1962. Now that's an awful long time after 1693, so there's several possibilities that could explain this. One, this thing's basically a time lord. It's timeless, it comes out of the TARDIS, it goes back down. No Doctor Who fans, that joke totally failed. Never mind, it's immortal is the joke. It has no age and it will go on forever. The other concept could be that we're talking about a breeding population, that the thing seen in 1962 was actually an offspring, a distant ancestor of this one. It also could be that the people that made the sighting in 1962 were even vaguely aware of this. This is a fairly famous image. You'll find it in a lot of books on various subjects in Massachusetts. And it's possible that they had a memory of it that they didn't even realize, saw something and put two and two together in the back of their head subconsciously and decided they had seen the same thing. Or it could be someone who absolutely knows about this and just decided, wouldn't it be fun to do a hoax? Let's tell everyone we saw the same thing. So there's a lot of possibilities here, but I do find it really interesting that it sort of rears its head back up so long after the original sightings. Let's talk about one of my favorites. I love this guy. Bigfoot. Funny enough, Bigfoot, if you talk to people that read up anything on cryptozoology, if they believe in Bigfoot, even if they don't believe in Bigfoot, most people think of Bigfoot as a story or a phenomenon that happens on the west coast of America. We hear stories from California, we hear stories from Oregon and Washington, and sometimes up in Canada. But most people don't realize that there are Bigfoot stories and Bigfoot-type creatures cited in every single state in America except for one. Can you imagine what that one state might be?
Hawaii?
Very good. Hawaii. Apparently Bigfoot does not like to swim. There is no Bigfoot story in Hawaii. They have their own interesting stories, but that's a whole different panel. And of course, Massachusetts is no exception. There are several areas of Massachusetts that have long-standing histories of Bigfoot stories. The first area that we usually talk about is Bridgewater, particularly in the Hockomock Swamp. We're actually going to talk a little bit about an area referred to as the Bridgewater Triangle in a while, but this is part of that group of phenomenon. People have been seeing some type of Bigfoot or large ape-like creature in that area at least since the 1940s, but there's some speculation that it's been even earlier than that. Some people even say that it's as early as Native American stories, although that's a little fuzzy. Some of those connections aren't as strong as some folks would tell you. But there does seem at least to be a history of some type of weirdness going around in there with odd critters. There's also an animal that's referred to as the Cobble Mountain critter in my end of the state. This critter usually shows up in the Westfield, Russell, Mass area. So you'll get sightings sort of along that Route 20 corridor that goes up through my part of western Massachusetts. And then the third one that mostly shows up is what's referred to as the Berkshires Bigfoot. This is seen in the Pittsfield area, mostly on an area called October Mountain. It's a particular state park. Again, October Mountain has an entire group of stories around it, but the most popular one's a Bigfoot. If you look into the Berkshire Eagle, for example, you'll find a ton of reports from the mid-1980s where people were reporting seeing something along this line on October Mountain at various campgrounds. Particularly, there's an old Boy Scout camp out there that I think it's called Camp Eagle, if I remember correctly. It's no longer used as a Boy Scout camp; it's abandoned. But tons of Bigfoot sightings were made out there, mostly between 1984 and 1987. Interestingly, one of the more famous ones from that area was a little bit closer to the end of the decade. It was 1989. There was a hiker that went to the top of October Mountain, and he reported that he saw something about 200 yards away through the trees that he couldn't see very clearly because he was so far away. He thought it was actually a black bear at first, so he got a little bit closer, and then he had a pair of binoculars, so he brought the binoculars up to his face, kind of had a look at it, and realized it was roughly about 7.5 feet tall. Definitely not a black bear because it was walking on its hind legs, which bears do not do. They can stand on their hind legs, but most of the time they walk on all fours. Apparently there's one exception to that. I saw a video of a bear that does in fact walk on its back legs, but that's pretty rare, so we're going to assume it wasn't the case. So he saw this thing walking back and forth in a small cleared area. He was quite frightened. He was afraid that if he ran even as far away as he was, it might hear him. So he basically stood still next to this tree and watched it for a while. And he reported that it was walking back and forth through this clearing, picking up large rocks and stacking them very neatly to one side, and then rummaging around in the ground where the rocks had been and picking something up and putting it in his mouth. He thought it possibly was insects or grubs or something that he was finding underneath. One of the interesting things also in his report was that he said when it turned and he got a profile view of it, it seemed to have a slightly elongated and slightly sort of tapered head, almost like it was wearing like a cone head from the old Saturday Night Live routine. Not quite so sharp at the top. He described it as being slightly rounded, but it had kind of elongated, odd-looking head. He watched it for a little while, and eventually it wandered off into the trees. As soon as he felt safe, he turned around and basically ran back down the mountain and got in his car. He also described it as having very thick, very heavy red-brown fur, but even with the binoculars, he said he was unable to get a really clear look at the face. It was really, really hard to see because of how far away he was. Interestingly enough, about 10 years later in the Cobble Mountain area, there's another report that was made by a group of campers who were all either early college or late high school students. One of them, they were kind of having a campsite around a fire. One of the young ladies kind of walked away because when you're on a campground and nature calls, sometimes you have to go into the woods. So she went into the woods, and her plan was that she would stay within sight of the fire, but far enough where she couldn't actually see her friends, so she wouldn't be interrupted. She did what needed to be done, and as she was sort of getting herself settled to go back into the campground, she saw some movement to one side of her. Again, she said it was roughly about 50 to maybe 60 yards away, and turned and looked, and there was something crouching in the bushes watching through the trees, watching her campground. And she made a startled noise, and it turned and looked at her, and she said she did get a fairly clear view of the face, considering that there was some firelight and there was a full moon at the time. It was in shadow to some extent, but she said mostly what she remembered was just seeing really big brown eyes, and that it looked just as scared of her as she was of it. It stood up. She said it was huge, covered in hair, same basic description, turned and walked quickly away into the woods. As soon as it was gone, she grabbed her rest of her stuff, ran into camp, told her friends, pack everything up, we're out of here, refused to go back in the tent, and made them go back to Westfield to stay at their friend's house. The interesting thing I find about this particular report is the fact that she noted when it turned away to walk away, she also noted that strange sort of elongated, slightly rounded, pointed head that was almost identical to the report that had been made roughly 10 years earlier. Now, I will say this. They were college students and late high school students. They said they were drinking sodas. Possibly, but I was a high school student, I know how this goes. So it is possible that she had a few too many. It is also possible that she saw someone that she misidentified as being something more like a Bigfoot. There are several people in the area, particularly on some of those campgrounds that are kind of squatters. They tend to be dressed in kind of ragged, not so great clothing, a lot of long hair, things like that. Sort of mountain men, I guess you would call modern mountain men. So it's possible that she saw a guy that was basically just fine on her campground and in her state saw it as Bigfoot. However, apparently when they got back into town, they were all quite frightened and seemed very real. So again, I leave it to you. Was it a mistaken drunken party, or did she really see something weird out there? I don't know.
Has anybody contacted people?
You can sometimes. The tricky thing about contacting people all the time is some of these, and always take with a grain of salt, but some of these are anonymous. Now, on one hand, I do take that with a grain of salt. If you're making a report anonymously, it's hard to track it down. On the other hand, even today, I kind of understand that. Try to imagine this. You go into work Monday morning and you go, Cindy, you're not going to believe what I saw on Saturday night. And you tell that story. Now, some people will be like, oh, that's really interesting. My sister saw something like that. There's a lot of people who are going to be like, oh, that's fantastic, Susan. Great for you. You know, I can understand why some people don't necessarily want to attach their names to something like that. So, again, it's a double-edged sword. One of the places that I do get a lot of information on some of this stuff is, believe it or not, we actually have a New England Bigfoot organization that collects reports. They do, I mean, they're enthusiasts, so again, you have to take it, but they do seem to try to really back their stuff up and get evidence and, you know, really talk to witnesses well and record as much as possible. So whenever I come across something like that, I always email them or contact them and say, do you know who this is? Is there any way that I can follow up with this? Sometimes it's successful, sometimes it's not. This particular young lady, I was actually able to follow up with. I'm not going to put her name in this because, again, she asked me not to, but she still lives in the Westfield area. She's now in her mid-30s, and when I got a chance to talk to her, she did seem very sincere. She also said, I just saw something really strange. I'm not going to call it a Bigfoot because I don't know what that was. I'm not sure I even believe in that kind of stuff. But whatever the heck it was, it didn't look like a human being to me. She still maintains that she wasn't drinking. It could, again, our memories, you know, sometimes when you're a teenager, especially in those circumstances, but she maintains that that's the case. So she seems very sincere to me, so at least to me, I wasn't drinking and I saw something weird feel. I definitely think she saw something weird. Now, what exactly it was is a whole other debate you could talk about. But I do think, at least in that case, she is being very sincere. I do not, unfortunately, have never talked to the gentleman that was on October Mountain, but that particular report was reported in the Berkshire Eagle, and there are copies of that on the internet that you can find. Any questions? Cool. Well, let's go. This is one of my favorites, only because this is really one of the weirdest stories I've ever come across. Also because this happened in 1977. So two weird things happened in 1977. We have the original sighting of the Dover Demon, and in September of 1977, a very, very weird young lady was born who would later grow up to be a librarian and talk about weird stuff like this. So, I love him because he's kind of my mascot for my birth year. But the Dover Demon is a very odd story. First of all, unlike most of the stuff on here when it comes to cryptozoology, this guy, as far as we know, seems to have only shown up for these 2 nights, and then he disappears from the record pretty much entirely. pretty much entirely, and we'll talk about that at the end. There may be some debate about that. He's seen in Dover, Massachusetts, mostly in the Farm Street area. Now, these photos were taken in 2013. Unfortunately, by the time we got up there, it was dark, so they didn't come out as nice. But the reason I wanted to go up there and photograph it specifically was two reasons. I wanted to show how dark the road is, even now, with streetlights and things on it. And also, I wanted to show that the fact that, now, these are very low ones, but there are little to slightly taller old farm walls all over the place in this town. I mean, we get them all over New England, period, but they are rampant here. Mostly because Dover was, and still is to some extent, a farm community. So especially those colonial farmhouses have all of these stone walls, and they still are there to this day. Some of them obviously have either been shortened or sort of upkept. Some of them are in more sort of ruinous state, depending on what you're looking at. It's also extremely dark. There are a lot of houses. There are many more houses there now than there was in 1977. But even then, most of the houses are fairly high off the road, and it is very dark going in between them. That was the one thing that just kept occurring to us as we drove through town. This is one of the darkest stretches of road I've ever been on. So this little thing was seen by three separate groups of people. William Bartlett was the first person to see it on the very first night. And the story William told was that he was driving around with two of his friends in the car, roughly about 10 o'clock at night on the first night. And they were just doing what kids did back then. I think there's a lot of people here that will remember the time before we had things like cell phones and the internet and all of that kind of thing. I barely remember it, but I was there. So, when you want to have a good time, you were bored on a Friday night, mostly what you did was you got in the car and drove around with your buddies. So they're just kind of doing what teenagers normally did. William was driving, so he had his eyes on the road. He had a friend of his in the seat next to him and one in the back seat. The two friends were talking to each other, so the young man in the front seat had his head turned and he was speaking to the young man in the back. So when William turned a corner and his headlights went around and illuminated this thing, he was the only one that saw it clearly. They only saw it for a few seconds, and he described it pretty much as you see it here, that it was fairly small. He thought roughly about 3.5 feet tall, that it was very, very pale, that it was climbing over one of the farm walls that they were driving past, and you could see that the hands and the feet were both gripping almost like a monkey's. In fact, he even described it as, for a couple of seconds, he thought this must be some kind of weird escaped monkey, because he just couldn't place it with any other kind of animal. He also described it as having glowing orange eyes as the headlights hit it. Now, there's some debate about whether it was actually glowing or whether we're talking about an animal whose eyes were basically reflecting light back from the headlights. William's opinion was that they were reflective, not that they were glowing on their own. Of course, I'm sure if you came around the corner and you saw something like this, you're going to make a noise. So startled, he sort of gave a yelp. His two buddies turned to see what was going on. And they did get a glimpse of it as it sort of scrambled back over the wall and ran off into the darkened trees that bordered this piece of farm property. They were so unnerved by this that they actually drove to the local law enforcement and basically made a report. They sent a car out with a couple of police officers to look at the area the next morning, but they didn't find anything. No footprints, no sign of this thing. The second person to see this is John Baxter, and this is on the same night. Now, roughly around the same time that William and his friends are making this discovery, John is sneaking out his bedroom window to go visit his girlfriend. He goes across a couple of pieces of farmland. They're fairly close to each other. He gets to his girlfriend's place. He hangs out for a couple of hours, does whatever you do with your girlfriend. And then at midnight, is like, I gotta go home. If my parents find out I snuck out, they're going to kill me. So he leaves. He starts to go home, and as he's walking up the street, he sees this small figure standing by the side of the road, leaning up against a wall and sort of almost hunched over slightly. It's very small, and it's fairly dark, and he can't see it really clearly. At first, he actually thinks it's a friend of his, maybe playing a prank, maybe hunched over more than he thought. Then he realizes it's not that hunched over. He can see that the legs are too straight, and his next thought is, it's a child. There's a child out here, and something's wrong, because a kid that young would not be out at midnight without their parents. So he approaches the figure to ask if it needs help. It straightens up and looks at him, and of course he gets a good look at it and absolutely freezes up. They stare at each other for a second. It basically hops over the wall, which is there again, and then scrambles off into the farmyard. He backs off, turns around and runs, gets part of the way up Farm Street and basically starts hitchhiking. He's picked up by a couple, they drop him off at his house. This is why I think there's something to it. Now, whatever he saw, we can talk about, but I think John did see something that scared him, because at midnight, or a little after midnight, he runs into his house, wakes both of his parents up, and tells them that something terrible is out there, and that they need to call the police. Now, I don't know about you, but when I was sneaking out did I say that? I never snuck out at midnight. I was a good kid. I never did this. When I was sneaking out at midnight, if I woke my parents up at, late at night like that, scaring the heck out of them, then I better have witnessed a murder, because I was going to get a whooping. So this kid definitely saw something that scared him bad enough that he wanted to at least let his parents know. They make a report. Again, it's followed up. They don't find anything. The very last official report of this is made by a young lady named Abby Brandon and her boyfriend the very next night, roughly about 9:30 at night, and almost identical to William's story. They're driving around, they come around a corner, it's standing leaning up against a tree rather than a wall, but same basic description. She said it sort of seemed like it was gripping the tree and it couldn't quite steady itself. When the headlights lighted up, both she and her boyfriend get a clear view of it. They both stop the car startled, it turns and runs into the trees, and they don't see it again. The only difference between their report and the other two reports is that they said that the creature's eyes lit up green in the headlights, not orange. That's the one difference. Yes?
Sarah, would you like me to shut the lights off so we can see this better?
You can. I don't know if folks are not. It's hard for me to tell because I'm standing here, but yeah, it might be a little bit better. Tell me if anyone gets too spooked out. We'll take it down a notch. So all of these teens are between the ages of 15 and 17. When I say they did not know each other, we have to be a little more specific. They knew of each other. This is a small town. They all went to the same high school. They probably saw each other around town, but they were not close friends. They didn't, as far as anyone can tell, they didn't have time to kind of all sit down and go, okay, this is how we're going to freak the adults out. There's no sign that there was an active hoax going on. Now, this does not necessarily mean that they saw exactly what they said they saw. There's several theories. Some people think that they saw a baby moose, which seems a little weird when you first look at this, but I've actually seen pictures of baby moose, especially the head, and I can see maybe where in a split second you might overreact to seeing something weird and fill in some of these details. There are some people that think that the kids themselves were a victim of a hoax, that somebody was basically pranking folks late at night, trying to have a good time, and that they honestly thought they saw what they saw, but they were actually victims of the hoax themselves. Or it's possible that some weird little critter was running around in Dover and they saw exactly what they said they saw. There was no evidence of anything else going on at the time, but the interesting thing is the area that the Dover demon was seen in actually has a long history all the way back to the colonial period of having weird stuff happen there. There's a rock called Puka Rock that's within that area that has all of these stories about people having weird mischievous spirits and fairies and other things play tricks on them. There's a series of sightings back in the late 1700s where several farmers in the area claimed that they saw the devil riding up the road on his horse leaving flaming hoof prints behind. Some really fun, really New England-y stories. But there does seem to be some history of some weird stuff going on here. Now, I felt that this pretty much was what the only time that this thing was seen, and that's generally true. Nobody else has come forward, especially at that time period, and reported this. However, there's a couple of things that happened afterwards and around the same time that means there's possibly more sightings. So weirdly enough, William, our first kid that made the sighting, said roughly a year later, he was out with his then girlfriend in the car, parked in kind of a dark area. I'm assuming they were talking about football. Let's go from there. And something hit the roof of the car, startling both of them. So they jumped out of the car. They didn't find anything on top of the car. There was no damage. But the girlfriend said, "What's that?" and kind of pointed. And they said they saw a small figure sort of running off into the trees in the dusk. Now, he did not say it looked like this. He said it was small, the same way this was small, but we didn't get a good look at it. There was a lot of foliage in between, so we're not 100% sure. But it reminded me of this in the way that it moved. So it's possible William saw it for a second time. Funny enough, I travel around Massachusetts and I do this all the time. And I've had several times where I presented this exact case in areas around. I did it in Natick a couple of years ago and some other towns right around the Dover area. and there almost always is someone that will come up to me and go, "You're wrong, someone else saw it. In 1977, my girlfriend came into a bar on, so-and-so night, and she said she saw exactly this thing 3 days after those kids made that report." Now, this is all people telling you this. So, again, people tell stories. It's possible that the girlfriend, for example, in that particular scenario, heard about this and wanted to be part of it. But it's interesting, at least, that some people seem to think that there might be something more going on here. So who knows? Maybe Dover's still around. We just haven't realized that it's still there. Let's talk Bridgewater for a second. Bridgewater's really interesting. Spooky pause. Bridgewater's really interesting. The whole Bridgewater area is supposed to have a very long history of supernatural and other types of occurrences, including crypto sightings, ghosts, UFOs, Bigfoot, giant birds, you name the weirdness, it's probably been reported in Bridgewater area somewhere. In the 1970s, because the Bermuda Triangle was all the rage at the time for people interested in this sort of thing, it was given the nickname of the Bridgewater Triangle, and that the boundaries were sort of illustrated by making a triangle on the map. It's not 100% accurate. The triangle is really kind of more of a blob if you really look at the reports, but roughly it's correct, so we'll go with it. It's kind of a nice image. And to go through the Bridgewater Triangle would be to do an entirely different lecture to you. It would take another hour or 2 hours just to go through Bridgewater. But I want to touch on a couple of the better cases and more interesting cases. In 1976, in the town of Abington, we have the black dog, also known as the devil dog. We love to put devil or demon on things. I think it makes it more spooky. And this was a series of killings of pets and farm animals that was done by a very large black dog of an unknown breed. There were many people that saw this thing. Now, up till then, it sounds like the kind of standard stray dog goes nuts and sort of starts taking small animals. But the reports got weirder and weirder as they came in. First of all, lots of people claimed that this dog was roughly the size of a small pony. Now, I've seen some pretty big dogs, and if you've ever seen the Pyrenees or any of those types, they're pretty big. So, depending on how small your pony is, that's not impossible, but it's pretty rare. That's kind of a weird thing. The other part of it that seems very strange is that people would claim they either shot at it or tried to, scare it off with farm tools or things along that line, and that the dog literally would dematerialize right in front of them in the air, basically just disappearing. There was also several reports of people that claimed that they shot at it more or less point-blank range, and it didn't seem to do anything. It just took off. The police investigated. There were some paw prints found that were pretty big, probably not the size of a small pony, but big. But this animal was never actually captured. It was never shot. They don't know what it was exactly. They don't know where it came from, and they don't know exactly where it went to. So it's kind of an odd case. It's not as supernatural-ish as some of the others, but it's weird enough that I found it really, really interesting. The Bridgewater Triangle incident in 1979, this was a series of UFO sightings in this area, all more or less described the same way as these sort of triangular-shaped objects, always with a light on each corner and one in the center. The lights on each corner were always white. 99% of the ones in the center were reported as being red, although there are a few reports out there that vary. A couple of ones that were green, one specific one that was blue, but almost always red. Lots of people reported this in 1979, but the interesting thing that I found was at the same time there were a newspaper reporter and a weatherman from one of the local channels, and I'm just going to look at my notes here because I always forget their names. Their names, and I'm going to really not get this one right, is Steve, I think it's Sbraccia, S-B-R-A-C-C-I-A, and Jerry Lopes was the other one, who were both well known in the area for working in the news, who also saw this and made a report. Now, the reason I mentioned these two guys specifically was, again, we just talked about this a minute ago. Nowadays, it's still kind of weird to go to work and say, hey guys, guess what I saw this weekend? UFO in my house. But in general, people are a little more open-minded, or at the very least, they're a little more live and let live. It's kind of like, okay, fine, Nancy thinks UFOs are real. That's weird, but she's harmless. It's all good. In 1979, especially if you had a job like being on television or having some sort of public faced and you went public and said, I saw this weird thing, you basically were begging your boss to hand you a pink slip. So I find it really interesting that these guys, at the very least, believed strongly enough that they saw something weird, that they were willing to put their jobs on the line. So since we just talked about this, let's talk about UFOs in Massachusetts. Massachusetts has a long history of strange lights and objects in the sky, all the way back, even before the European settlers arrived. There's some Native American mythology that talks about various things in the sky. The European settlers also talked a lot about seeing weird things, usually in context of either some type of a biblical event that they believed was going on, or weirdly enough, witch trials. We have a huge history of witch trials in New England. Salem's the most popular, but they're actually all over the place. And a lot of people that testified at witch trials would claim to see things in the sky that were supposed to be related to witches. So it's possible that they were in fact seeing something, they were just relating it to something that wasn't part of it. I want to talk about two sort of direct alien abduction cases that were out of Massachusetts that became very famous. The Andreessen affair kind of hit the scene in the very late 60s and early 70s. There were several books written about it. At the time, this went as famous as the Betty and Barney Hill case, if people are familiar with that one. Life magazine covered this, the Time magazine covered it, and there's a huge debate about this case still to this day. Even though the very first event was supposed to be in 1967, there are still people that are interested in this that are talking about what exactly we're looking at. Lots of people think this was a hoax. Lots of people think this lady was out of her mind and that all of this was a big hallucination. And lots of people think it was absolutely real. And it gets more complicated because her family members were involved, and just as many family members are torn about this. Some of her family came right out and said, we don't think any of this happened, we think she needs help. There are other people in her family that came out and said she made the whole thing up, and some family members went along with it because books sold and they got rights from the books. And then there's other family members that said she's absolutely telling the truth, this really happened and I remember some of this. So that just makes it even more complicated to try to figure out exactly what we're looking at. One of the other things that's really unique about this case is that Betty Andreessen was an evangelical Christian, and it's one of the very first UFO cases where at least some of what was going on seemed to be either influenced or supporting her evangelical beliefs. We'll get into that in just a minute. We haven't really seen that before in an abduction case. Now, after the Andreessen affair, there were other people that came forward and told similar stories or had sort of similar crossovers, and it wasn't just Christian beliefs. Sometimes it was Buddhist or New Age or whatever it was. People were claiming that aliens would pick them up and then tell them all kinds of things. We're space brothers, we're angels, God wants to talk to you, all sorts of things. And there was some debate about assuming that's actually really what happened, what that could even mean. We'll get into that in just a second. Betty was also an artist to some extent, so some of this stuff here was actually one of the drawings she did. But there were also lots of drawings that were done when she was put under hypnosis and told some of her story. The original abduction in 1967, she claimed, started with her family being home for the night. In their home, they saw some weird flashes of light outside that they thought was heat lightning, and then Betty realized that everyone in her living room had basically seemingly gone into some kind of state of suspended animation. They weren't reacting to her at all. She turns around, and several small creatures that were big head, large eyes, your sort of standard X-Files alien description, basically morphed through the solid wood of her door. Any comic book fans in the audience tonight? Okay, I'm not going to make a Kitty Pryde joke, that will fall flat. So they kind of phase through this door. They take her onto their ship. They give her a basic medical examination, which is kind of par for the course of these things. But then it gets much stranger from there. For one thing, over the years of her claiming to be abducted, she comes across several different types of beings. I already pointed out the fact that the original beings sort of had these large eyes, but they definitely had pupils. Much later on, she said there were other beings that had basically the same description, but had the totally black eyes that we now are used to from a lot of science fiction. And then much later on, she had what some people in the UFO community refer to as Nordics. These are beings that are much, much taller than regular humans. They're usually blonde and blue-eyed, and they look very beautiful. They're sometimes described as angels. This is how Betty recognized them. She thought they were angels. She talks a lot about being brought to another planet or another plane of existence, depending on sort of your interpretation, including the idea that she was put into a glass chair with a top that came down over her and liquid that filled up because they said that they needed to do this to her in order to keep the pressure from going from various realities or various planets from harming her body, which was really interesting. I'd never heard of that before. And then several years after I saw this case in my early teens, there was a fabulous old science fiction movie called This Island Earth. Is anyone familiar with that one? Oh, see it. It's classic. But anyway, there's a scene in it where it's not liquid, it's mist, but they put the main characters in these tubes and put mist over them for the exact same reasoning. I'm not saying that Betty made this up based on that, but it is possible that under hypnosis she was influenced by that film. It was very famous in the 1950s and most people saw it, even if they weren't necessarily science fiction fans. So in all fairness, I have to note that it's possible she was influenced by that. She also talked about a lot of different parts of her journey, including star writing. She wrote this sort of odd language, and she spoke in this language. Now, interestingly enough, they recorded her speaking this strange language and sent it out to several people that were professionals and experts in languages. They said that as far as they can tell, it is not a language, it's basically gibberish. But the interesting thing was that several people, linguists that listened to it, said that it did have a certain cadence and pattern that seemed to suggest language, even though they didn't recognize it. Now, I would also add that they've done some studies on people that speak in tongues during religious ecstasies, and the exact same thing will happen. The thought process on this from sort of the scientific end of things is that while your brain is while you're coming up with this sort of talk, this strange language, that your brain is organizing it in a way that it would organize actual language in the throes of sort of your ecstasy. There's other explanations as well. People believe different things. So it's possible, again, that we're looking at someone who's basically...
Turn right toward Massachusetts Avenue, then turn left on Massachusetts Avenue.
Thank you, Directions Ghost, but I don't need it yet. Give me about an hour and I'll talk to you. It's okay, don't worry about it.
I was abducted by myself after that.
Oh, okay, all right, no problem. It's not a big deal. I'm sorry. So one of the things I do want to add at the very end here, I used to have a slide for it with some of what she says, but I think I took it out, is she describes in the middle of the hypnosis a moment of being brought before, by these creatures being brought before what she describes as glass gates, with a great light behind it, that the gates open, she goes through, and she has some sort of religious experience. She refers to this light or presence as the Father, and when the gentleman that had her under hypnosis, the doctor says, can you tell me anything about what he said? But she says, no, this is my experience, you're not allowed to know, you will only know when you come to the Father, and then you will have your experience. So again, there's this odd layer of sort of religious ideals. Now, there's several different theories about why that might be. Number one, if she's sort of coming up with all this in her own mind, either hoaxing it or having some sort of hallucination or some kind of breakdown with believing it, it may be just part of her own psyche influencing what she's reporting. There's also kind of an interesting theory, and of course, theoretically, it could really be angels, and who knows? There's all sorts of strange things out there. But there's an interesting theory that says that if these are actually aliens, if they're studying us, if all of this actually happens the way she reports it, it would be interesting for someone who's trying to study another species to take on the persona of very deeply held belief, religious figures, things along that line. We see ourselves doing this in history. The conquistadors, for example, going into South America and pretending to some extent to be their gods. So some people believe that these aliens, these creatures from another planet or another plane of existence, took on the persona of these things that she would recognize as being religious, either to see how she would react, or maybe so that she would be more comfortable with them. If she believed them to be angels, she's more likely to cooperate. Interesting theories on all ends, but again, who knows? I leave it up to you. Very quickly, I want to go to the Reed family abductions. This starts in the spring of 1966. And it mostly involves two very, very young boys, Thomas and Matthew. Thomas is age 6 when it starts, and Matthew is age 4. Most of it starts off after, funny enough, very much like the Andreassens, they see some odd balls of light in the house, and the mother actually believed the house was haunted. But several days after the original orbs show up, the boys reported being out in their backyard playing. Now, they lived on a farm, so they had a very large piece of land, including a barn and some animals. And then their property was also bordered by very thick woods that the boys used to play in. And they were sort of out in one of the back fields playing, and they said that they saw sort of your standard silver disc-shaped object come down to the field. These strange creatures came out, came to talk with them, brought them on board the ship, took them for a journey, did a medical examination on them. They also said that they had the experience of having images put into their minds. They couldn't remember everything, but they remembered specifically seeing a galaxy sort of expanding and a willow tree, that the willow tree was very important for some reason, but they couldn't remember. Roughly about a year later, the boys reported being taken again in a very strange manner. The oldest boy, Thomas, woke up and found that Matthew, who was supposed to be asleep in the bed next to him, was gone. So this is fairly late at night, I think about 11 o'clock if I remember correctly. Thomas goes to get his mother and his grandmother, who are the adults of the house, tells them that Matthew's missing. They assume he's sleepwalking, they search the house, they can't find him, they search the barn and the basic backyard, they can't find him. They come back into the house in order to call the sheriff's department to ask them to send out police officers, and as they're kind of going to do this, they hear the front door slam, even though both women said they know that they closed the door. They turn startled to look, and when they turn back around, Thomas is now gone from the middle of the room. They call the police come out, they do a search of the property, they bring dogs. They also search the preliminary area of the woods right against the house. They can't find the kids, they go back to the house in order to call for backup and to make a report, and both the boys are standing at the bottom of the driveway in their pajamas looking kind of dazed and kind of not like they understand exactly what's going on. Thomas claims that the last thing he remembered was being in the living room with his mom and his grandma. Matthew said he had no memory at all of any of this going on, that he just went to bed and then woke up next to his brother in the driveway. And then about 2 years later, the family reported that a large object came down in front of their car while they were driving home late at night from a church function, and that the whole family was taken, and that the next thing that they remembered was waking up in the car, but that some of the members of the families were actually sitting backwards in the seat, and the mother woke up standing outside of the car. They also talk about seeing some kind of reptilian-type aliens that were different from the ones they had encountered before during this period. Now, pretty strange. Some stuff, boys could have been sleepwalking. Lots of stuff going on here. But again, it's a weird case, and a lot of folks, again, are still debating about what exactly might have happened to them. One of the things I find really interesting, these little boys are so cute. They did some sketches, but an artist basically drew what they claimed the aliens or the beings that took them looked like. Now, the thing I find fascinating about this is, in a lot of ways, this is a standard sort of what we think of as being an alien. You have the elongated head, the big black eyes, the long kind of arms with only a few fingers on them, but the actual body shape is not like anything else I've ever seen in any of these cases. It's very unique. It's very insect-like. So again, if nothing else, these boys had really interesting imaginations. Or they saw something really strange. I'm not really sure. But I do like the fact that we're seeing something very different than what we're used to. And I want to mention Joseph's Restaurant. In 1973, there's a UFO sighting. Joseph's is no longer there. It was in this kind of plaza. But unless it's changed since 2013, there's an excellent Indian restaurant there. We ate there after I took the photos. Definitely go, if nothing else, for the Indian food. Now, this was pretty much a standard UFO sighting. As you can see, my Photoshop skills are not that great, but you get the picture. Large silver disc moves over the parking lot, hovers. They said it was probably the size of a small plane, kind of hovers for a few minutes, and then basically takes off in the sky. Not all that exciting, pretty much your standard UFO sighting. The interesting thing about this case is how many people actually saw it. So the restaurant, this happens roughly about 12:30 in the afternoon on a work day. The restaurant's packed with people, so there was tons of customer witnesses. Both the waitresses, the short order cook, and the owner of the restaurant all came out to stand at the windows and watch this thing go by, including 2 state troopers that publicly came out and said, "We saw this with everyone else." Again, like our friends from the TV news station, in 1973, if you were a state trooper and you said, "I saw a flying saucer," there was a good chance someone was going to hand you a pink slip. So again, I don't know what they saw, but I do think they saw something that they thought was weird enough to risk coming out. Now, again, experimental aircraft from the military, misidentified blimp, could be a number of things. Could be a saucer full of aliens. But they definitely saw something that they felt was important to come forward with, and that's why I find this case really interesting. And, of course, everyone loves the paranormal stuff. Ghost stories are basically a fabric of our actual state because they come from a long time. Now, I'm going to go out on a limb. I usually don't take sides on here, but I will say this. This is kind of an interesting photo, but I'm very skeptical of orb pictures. Orbs, especially on cameras with flashes, are really easy to mistake. Most everything with a flash looks like an orb. A drop of water, a speck of dust, pretty much anything. I'm not going to go and say every single orb is not something weird because I don't actually know that. But I do know that it's really, really, really easy to pick something up that looks like an orb. So in general, if all I'm looking at is orb pictures, I'm a little on the skeptical side. But, you know, that doesn't mean that there's nothing there. There can be some other interesting things. So I'm just going to advise, when you see orbs, grab a grain of salt, just a little one. Let's talk about one of my favorite haunted places in Massachusetts, Theodore's in Springfield. Theodore's is on Worthington Street, and it is one of the most popular places in Springfield, Massachusetts. It's a blues club and a really good barbecue joint, also an excellent bar if you like to have a good mixed drink once in a while, just once in a while. Ghost Hunters did an episode here, so if people are Ghost Hunters fans, you might have seen this. And there's a ton of reports about activity in the building. One of the things that's kind of interesting about this is that because of the fact that it is a club, there's constantly bands there. If there's not a band, the jukebox and sound systems are playing all the time. There's a million people packing the place. Even at noon on a Wednesday, you still get a ton of people going in for lunch. The barbecue is that good, I'm not lying. So you get most of these stories from people that actually work there. Because if you're a customer there, you're not really going to hear or see anything. There's just too much noise. But a lot of people that work there will talk about things that happen after hours. For one thing, there's a basement level that they keep kegs and other things for the bar. There's a lot of people, particularly women, particularly waitress and female bar staff, who go down and say that they feel hands touching them, particularly their hair, and have occasionally heard a male voice down either say their name, or sometimes they'll report hearing a male talking as if having a conversation, not hostile, just having a conversation, but they can't make out the words. A lot of people felt really uncomfortable going down there, however, because even though it was gentle touching, they weren't really thrilled about the sensation of being touched. There's also a pool hall on the second floor, and a lot of the employees will say once they closed up for the night and they cleaned everything up in the pool, tables are all taken care of, they will come downstairs and start locking up, and they can hear people playing pool. They hear the balls clapping together, and they hear footsteps of people moving around. They go up to check, and of course everything is still wrapped and all put away for the night, so that's kind of interesting. My favorite is that it no longer exists there, but there used to be a camel pin bowling alley on the fourth floor way back in the 1950s and 60s, several wait staff have reported hearing bowling balls and pins falling late at night, and haven't bothered to go check because those bowling alleys haven't been there for probably as long as I've been on the planet. So it's a pretty interesting kind of notation at the end. As we give a couple of pictures, as you can see, this is what I mean. It is an extremely busy bar area and an extremely busy restaurant, so it's tough to go in and see something unless you get permission to go in after hours. Let's talk about Danvers State Hospital for a second. Danvers opened in 1878. They officially closed in the early 90s as an actual hospital, and the majority of the buildings were demolished in 2006. There's a few pieces of buildings still there, but most of it's gone. It's actually condos now, and I take my hat off to anyone who bought one, because I'm not totally superstitious, but I was a little like, I don't know, maybe if you give me a free one, but... so Danvers, all by itself, has an interesting history that I could do an entire speech just on. Danvers started off as a mental hospital, and it started off as a very progressive place. The idea of opening Danvers was to try to get a place where they could try new ideas to help mental patients either heal or at least come to a term where they could actually live their lives out in comfort and in productivity. So at first, it had a lot of things that other mental hospitals didn't have. They had these ideas about trying to treat patients like human beings. I know, at the time period, very progressive. And the idea was that they were going to try to give them advantages that a lot of other hospitals didn't provide. So on top of having doctors and treatments, they had things like art therapy, where they had entire rooms that they dedicated to creating art. They had a theater there. They had a gymnasium where people could play basketball and do other sports. They had entire parts of the wings where they would teach people how to cook or do culinary things. There were huge gardens on the property where they did both kitchen gardens for actual food and to help feed the people that lived there, and also just flowers and beautiful things. So for a long time, especially in its early history, they were really trying to do something really, really, really different, and for a long time it worked. The problem was by the early 1930s, the hospital was severely overcrowded. There weren't enough people to keep up with what was going on, and care of patients started slipping pretty badly. Now, I will say, as far as I've been able to tell, Danvers never got as bad as places like, say, Belchertown State Hospital. Most of what happened there was neglect rather than straight-out abuse, although I don't want to say there was no abuse, there definitely was. But most of it was more neglect, which still doesn't excuse it. But a lot of the doctors and nurses there were trying their best. They just really couldn't keep up with what was going on. They were failing pretty badly. After the big reveal about Belchertown State Hospital, if you don't know that story, by the way, look it up. It's extremely sad, but also very fascinating. A lot of hospitals all around the country were shut down in the early to mid 80s because of that. And Danvers followed quite soon after in the early 90s. They stopped actually taking in patients, and the building became abandoned. It was quite beautiful, and it was huge. They used to call it the Bat. The main center here was where all of the offices and doctors' offices, kitchens, all of that stuff I just talked about. And then mostly the two wings here were for separated activities. So one was all for women's stuff, and the other wing was for men's. And that included housing, but also some other places that they didn't want people to mix. In certain parts of the hospital, it was as high as 5 stories, although most of it was closer to 3. And if you got a chance to have a look on the inside, of course, all of these photos were taken after the hospital closed, and it was pretty much falling apart. But you can still see there was some really beautiful architecture in these huge rooms. And of course, once the building closed, tons of people would sneak in there. That was a big, ghost hunting place. I never actually snuck in. These were photos I found online many years after it was torn down. But there were stories all over the place, people talking about going in there and hearing voices, seeing lights in parts of the building that no longer had electricity, all kinds of things. The thing I find really interesting about this, however, is that my favorite ghost story from here isn't even from that time period. It's actually from when the hospital was still working as a hospital. There were doctors and nurses that had to be on call on hospital grounds 24/7. They were either experts, or for whatever reason they could not be any further than basically crossing a lawn to get to the building if there was an emergency. So in some of the buildings there were apartments that the doctors and their families could live in so that they could be there all the time. And there's a young lady at the time, she was quite elderly when she was talking about it, in the 1940s, whose father was a doctor there. She was a little girl at the time. Her brother was even younger. I believe she was about 11. The brother was younger, 6 or 7, who used to report waking up in the middle of the night in her room in the apartment and seeing an old woman dressed in very turn-of-the-century type clothing who would be making sure, tucking her brother in or folding what appeared to be clothes, except there's nothing there, at the bottom of the bed, doing things in the room that seemed to suggest she was trying to take care of her children. She was interviewed on NPR. I had to find it archived online. I want to say she was interviewed in '92. Just before the hospital closed, so she may not even be alive anymore, to be honest with you. But she was saying that she never felt afraid of this particular entity. She always felt like it was part of the place, and that it was just trying to take care of them. So there seems to be at least some stories going around that stuff was going on even before the hospital closed. But of course, afterwards, it was all over the place until it was torn down. Now, there's two kind of post-tear down stories I find really interesting. First of all, when the hospital, right before the hospital was torn down, now this is a fiction film, but if you want to get a good sense of what Danvers was like, find a suspense, I call it a horror movie, it's not straight horror, called Session 9. The entire film was in Danvers. It was about 2 years before it was torn down. It's not sets. Everything in there is them actually filming in Danvers. Every piece of old equipment that they use, every old abandoned wheelchair, file cabinets, everything you see in that movie is relics that they found in Danvers and used as props. Very spooky movie. I very much like it. One of the actors in it, who is a Scottish actor, and it's Peter Mullen, who is the main character in this film, talks about being on the roof of Danvers as they were filming. They were filming a scene. His part was done. He was sitting over on the side drinking a soda. He was watching them finish the filming on the other end. And he told this story about suddenly just understanding how he could make his life perfect, how everything would just come together. It was the simplest solution he had ever thought of. He was just felt stupid for not realizing this sooner. He was going to jump off the building, and that would solve everything. And then he realized what he was thinking, and he got up and went to the director and said, "You better get what you need from me up here because I'm going downstairs and I'm not coming back up here again." He said he'd never been so scared by a thought before in his life. He said especially because he was not depressed, he wasn't upset, nothing. It just seemed like logic. Logically, ending it all would take care of everything. And to this day, he still says, "I don't think that was me. I think something else was there and was trying to get me to do this." A couple of years later, they tear the building down, and one of the kind of interesting postscripts is that during the construction of the condominiums on the west side of what the building, the fire broke out close to the conclusion of doing that work, burned a good chunk of the condos down. They had to basically start from scratch, put the construction back by a long time. There is video of this starting. I think you can still find it online. But very quickly when the fire started, all of the video or all the surveillance cameras in the area went dead, and they don't know why. They also don't know why the buildings burned. They never found any sign of arson, no reason that anything went wrong. To this day, every year, roughly around this time, I double check online to see if I can find an article where they finally go, "We finally figured out what happened at Danvers," so I can take this part of the story out. I have yet to find it. So at least 10 years of we don't know why this happened. Again, could be something we just don't know, a glitch, something electrical that they didn't even know was there. But I still find it weird, and I think it's kind of a nice, creepy ending to that story. Let's talk about the Boussom Tunnel. The Boussom Tunnel from my area, but a little bit further up. This is a railroad tunnel that runs between North Athens, Massachusetts and Florida, Massachusetts. At the time that it was constructed, it was considered one of the great sort of engineering feats of its day. They used a lot of equipment that was brand spanking new. They started it in the 1850s, and the last construction was done by the end of the late 1870s. And there were drills that were used in this that were never used before. There was a lot of explosives that they used here that was never used before. So not surprising, it also has a nickname, the Bloody Pit. Numbers vary slightly because their record keeping wasn't spectacular back then, especially because they're pretty sure some of the workers were maybe more under the table than they wanted to admit. But they estimate roughly about 200 people died actually creating this tunnel. It's very long. It goes under the Boussom Mountains. We know for a fact that there's a couple of incidences. There's one where one of the workers accidentally let a charge off too early and killed 4 people in the explosion. There's a larger incident about 2 years later where they were working and they believed there was a gas pocket that one of the lanterns actually set off and there was an explosion, and that was 14 men that were buried. The really awful thing about that particular story is that while at first they assumed everyone had simply died in the collapse and it took them a very long time to dig the bodies out, there was evidence that came later, especially because it's a very wet area, so they were running pumps to get water out of the shaft while they were working, and as soon as the explosion happened, the pumps failed, so the shaft started to fill with water. They found out later on that not everyone died in the initial explosion. They lived long enough to try to build a raft, and that most of them either drowned or they suffocated when the water level got high enough where the gas met them and they no longer had any oxygen. So these poor men they died pretty terribly. And there's a whole series of incidences. That's probably the worst one, but there's a whole series of incidences there where we know for a fact there was some pretty awful stuff going on. There is a story, there's many stories that have come out over the years, people claiming to see lights in the tunnel, hearing men call out or screaming, or sometimes just talking. Sometimes it's not necessarily horrific, but that they can hear voices. I have been here. I have not gone into the tunnel. I should add, for anyone here that might be an intrepid ghost hunter, this is still an active train tunnel, so don't go poking your head in there because you probably will find out if there really is such thing as ghosts or not. but if there is, you'll find out by becoming one, so don't do it. Not a good idea. But I was able to go up to the kind of, poke my head in just for a couple of inches. One of the things I noticed right away is there's constantly airflow through it, so it's very hard to hear anything in there because you're constantly hearing what sounds sort of like background wind noise, and I could see where that might sound like either talking or people screaming in the distance. However, I haven't been deep in the tunnels, so I don't know. There's some weird stories that come out of there. One of my favorites, however, is a report that was made by a gentleman who used to work for the Boussom Railroad. He was interviewed in 1977. His name was Joseph Impacco, and he worked for them all through the 30s and 40s and 50s, and he was interviewed by the Springfield Republican at the time about his time working for the railroad and his different jobs, and he told a wonderful ghost story about the Boussom Tunnel that I choose to decide that if these things are real, I want to think this one is. So what he described was one of his jobs was he would go into the tunnel in the winter and scrape ice and other sort of condensation off the rail lines because that could become a problem. It would break, and when it froze and that sort of thing, it would sometimes break railroad tracks. So he would go in and he would scrape. And of course, he would have a schedule when the trains were coming, so he would have time to go in, do his work, and get out again. Now, all through the railroad tunnel, there are places, there are alcoves that are built in the wall. So if you're a worker and you hear the train coming, you can get up and walk across and basically duck into the alcove while the train goes by, and then you come back out and you continue to work. Now, one of the things that Joseph noted was that these alcoves can hold two men, but you have to stand back to chest. You can't stand side by side. So he's working on the line one day. He thinks everything's okay, and suddenly somebody says in his ear, "Joe, get up!" And someone grabs him by the arm and pulls him across the track into the alcove. And as he's being pulled in the alcove, here comes the light of the train he didn't know was coming. He couldn't hear it because of that wind effect I was talking about. It was early, and they did not realize there was a man in the tunnel, so they never thought to check anything. They just went through. He says to this day that he believes whatever's in there saved his life, especially because he noted that whoever it was that grabbed him was directly next to him as they pulled him into the alcove. So in order to pull that feet off, you literally would have to step into the solid rock of the mountain in order to pull him in to the position he was in. So to this day, or to whenever he went to the great beyond and discovered whether the stuff's real or not, he believed that these spirits had saved his life. Let's talk about Lucy Keys. This is a sad story that has a ghost story attached to it. The first part of the story is true. We know for a fact this is historical. Although it's a mystery all in itself, even without the ghost part. Lucy Keys, her family lived on Mount Wachusett in 1775. They had a farm in the area with several other families that were farmers. And Lucy lived there with her mother and many siblings and her father, who was a farmer. And one day, her mother sent her two older sisters to go down to the local lake to gather sand. One of the things they used to use sand for, amongst other things, was cleaning floors. So she sent the sisters down to get some of the sand they used to clean, and Lucy wanted to go with them. And her mother said, "No, you're too little." She was about 4 years old. And the mother went about doing the farmyard chores. The father was sort of off doing his farming chores. And as soon as she was no longer being supervised, Lucy snuck off to join her sisters. And that's the last anyone ever saw of Lucy. We never find out what happened to her. No one ever does. They realized fairly quickly that Lucy is gone. The family searches the local area and can't find them, and they bring in neighbors to help look, and it becomes very apparent within several days that they are simply not going to find her. And that's it. Lucy disappears from history. We don't know what happened to her. Now, there's a couple of things that come up in history books that talk about what might have happened to her. One of these stories I repeated in this panel until last year when I found some other information that suggests that's not possible. So there's a story, if you look up this account, there's a story that comes up that talks about a neighbor who was very jealous of the family, who had a long-standing conflict with him over land, who claimed on his deathbed that he accidentally came across Lucy in the woods, and he was so enraged by her family that he was overcome by his rage. He took the moment to take out on the family by killing the poor kid, hiding her body, and then offering to lead the search party so they would not find her. The problem with this is that the guy that supposedly made his deathbed confession at this time period was probably about Lucy's age. And there's no evidence he ever had any contact with the family otherwise. Now, there's a couple of different reasons this story might have come up. It's possible that it simply was that part of it was folklore that just got kind of tacked on. It's also possible because you find out much later on that this guy did not have the greatest relationship with a lot of people in his family. So it's also possible that some family members that didn't like him years later decided to create this story and try to make it sound like their family member was a murderer. The gentleman's name, I'm going to check my notes really quick, just in case you ever come up with this. His name was Tilly Littlejohn. So if you come across the Tilly Littlejohn theory, it has pretty much been debunked completely by historians that know the time period. However, there's another theory that's really interesting. About 30 years after her disappearance, a couple of fur trappers came back down to the area with a story. Now, her parents, I believe, were gone by this point, but they came back down to the area with a story of doing some trading, fur trading over the Canadian border with a group of Native Americans, and while they were in the Native American camp, came across a woman who was very obviously a white woman who had been adopted into the tribe, which was not all that unusual at that time period. But she spoke a very small amount of English, but it was very obvious that she had mostly lived her life there. She was much more comfortable speaking the native language. She was married to one of the tribe members. She was very much a part of the tribe. And while they were talking to her, she kept saying something about Chusets. She kept saying Chusets during the conversation. And at first the men thought that she was referring to Massachusetts, but due to a few other words that she knew, eventually they thought she might have been saying Wachusets. And their theory was that that might have been Lucy. There was a history of Native Americans, particularly right after skirmishes and other things that would sort of take tribe members away, who would sometimes either after a battle or sometimes just sort of randomly take settlers' children to basically repopulate their own groups to basically make up for the kids and people who had been killed. And there's various tribes treated people in various ways. Some treated them very well as part of the members of the tribe. Others didn't necessarily treat them very well. But it's very possible that that was Lucy's fate. It's kind of sad in the sense that her parents particularly never found out what happened to her until they died. They never stopped looking for her. I know it's not, we don't have the facts and the big question mark is still there, but personally, I like to believe that that's what happened to her, that she was taken in by this tribe, and while her poor parents never got to find out what happened to her, she was loved and had a family. But that's just because I like happy endings, so that's just my personal take on it. So of course, in the area, even to this day, people say that they see all number of things that seem to go back to Lucy's case. The area is now a ski resort, and there is a number of stories of skiers that go out in the winter, particularly when they do night trails, who will come across a series of young child's footprints in the snow. They're barefoot. They follow them because, I don't know about you, but if I'm out in the middle of winter and I see barefoot child footprints, I'm going to try to find where that kid is because they're obviously in trouble. And those footprints literally stop and just sort of seem to disappear. People claim that they hear a woman calling out for Lucy in the forest when they go hiking, and there's even been some reports of people seeing a very young girl in what appears to be an old-fashioned sort of white shift running in and out of the trees, and when people try to catch up with her, she will disappear. So who knows? But we do know that whatever happened to Lucy, unfortunately, the answer for that question probably will never be resolved.
An independent film was made of her story.
Oh, I would be surprised, yeah. It's a very famous story here. Salem, I, again, could do multiple presentations on Salem. It would take forever. We're only going to talk about one particular case that I really like in Salem. But there's a lot of history here, and there's also a lot of folklore here. And one of my favorite pieces of folklore is the Joshua Ward House. The Joshua Ward House originally was not the Joshua Ward House. It was the sheriff, Sheriff Corbin's house, who also used it as the prison, the local prison. So he was the sheriff who was directly involved with the Salem witch trials, and by all accounts, he was a sadist. This was a guy that enjoyed torturing people, could not wait to get you down there, to get you to confess. Is anyone familiar with the story of Giles Corey? He's the only person that died in the trials that was not Does anyone know that one?
He was crushed.
Yeah, he was crushed to death. Good. Good to know there's still folks that remember that one. Giles would not confess for two reasons. His family stated later, one was that he felt that the trial of all of these people, particularly people like Rebecca Nurse, was an affront to God, that they were insulting God by saying that these obviously pious and upstanding members of the community were witches, that was insulting and he would not stoop to it. The other reason was a little more practical. Once you confess to witchcraft, your property was seized by the state or by the town and could be redistributed or sold. So a lot of people didn't want to confess one way or the other because they didn't want to lose their kids or their other family members to lose their property. And the sheriff was the one that came up with the idea of piling rocks on top of this old man until he confessed, which he did not. He died. He'd rather be crushed to death than confess to something that he did not do. In fact, according to history, his last words were, in fact, more weight. Whatever else, you have to respect that. That guy, that's some pretty heavy stuff right there. So this was not a nice man. He was a very kind of awful man. And once the Salem witch trials were over, a lot of people in town turned on him because many of them had friends or relatives who had been accused and who had been harmed by him. So much so that only a few years after the Salem witch trials, he died of a heart attack at age 30, which even back then was pretty young and pretty weird. Now there are rumors running around that he was cursed. I'm not going to go much into that because I think that's more folklore than anything else. But we can say for sure that on top of the fact that they kept the body in the basement for several months because the ground was too hard to bury him in, they were also afraid to bury him because they thought that local townspeople would dig him up and drag him through town. He was that much hated. So eventually they did bury him. The original house on the property was gone, and the Joshua Ward house was built on top of it. And it served as multiple purposes over the years. It was an inn. In fact, supposedly George Washington stayed there at one point. But many, many, many years later, we have lots of ghost reports from here, voices. People claim to feel like they're being choked, which is one of the sheriff's favorite ways to get you to confess. There will be books and garbage cans that are overturned, or some people claim have flown across the room right in front of them. But the most interesting story that comes out of here is in the mid-1980s, the house was being used in a commercial sense as a real estate office, and the gentleman that owned the business was taking photos of his employees in order to put them on a Christmas wreath. He takes a photo of a young employee, and this is what pops out of the Polaroid. Nope, that's my 15-minute warning, so I don't go over my time. Which means we might have to skip over a few things, but that's okay. So this is what pops out of the camera. And there's still a great debate about what we're looking at here. Is it a mistake? Is it a chemical imbalance in the Polaroid? Or are we looking at something spectral? Whatever else, you gotta admit it's pretty creepy. We have a woman that appears to be in a long black dress, kind of a crazy hair going on here, and very skeletal looking, although very blurry, face and hands. This is the most famous photo that's come out of the Joshua Ward house, and again, even though this was taken in the mid-80s, there's still a lot of debate about what we're looking at. I like it, even if it's a mistake or it's not real, just because, God, that's such a great photo. Like, what a great Halloween photo. Let's talk about half-hanged Mary for a minute. I'm going to cut her story down just a little bit because we still have two more to get to by the end. But the basic story is that Mary, whose actual name was Mary Webster, I believe? Yes, Mary Webster. In 1683, her neighbors in Hadley, Massachusetts, neighbors to my own Springfield, accused her of witchcraft. They said all sorts of things about her. She was bewitching cattle. She was scaring the children. Now, keep in mind, she was also a woman who was very typical of this sort of accusation. She was older. She was in her 60s. She was married, which actually most of the time these were widowers or people that never been married. But she was actually still married. However, she was probably an alcoholic from the description. She was poor, so she was a beggar. She was asking people for money all the time. And if she didn't like you, she had no problem letting you know that. Especially if she nicely asked you for money and you said no. Then she usually would release her tongue on you, and they didn't like that. So they sent her to Northampton, and Northampton came back, and I really apologize for the pun, but I don't know how else to describe it. They come back as a hanged jury. They don't really know whether she's a witch or not. So they send her to Boston. Boston puts her on trial, and quite surprisingly for the time period, they say, this woman is innocent. She is not a witch, send her home. So they send her home, and the neighbors are still saying, but she's a witch, we know she's a witch. Well, the problem with all of this comes to a head right in 1685 when one of the neighbors, Philip Smith, who is an upstanding member of society. He's a local church father, he's very wealthy, he's known to be very generous with his money, everybody loves him, you know this type. So he got into an altercation with Mary. They ended up in a screaming match at one point when she asked him for money on the street, and they both sort of are glaring daggers at each other. So everybody knows that Mary hates him. And then in January of 1685, suddenly, he comes down with a strange illness that nobody can identify. He takes to his bed. He's bleeding from the eyes and the nose. His body swells up. He's screaming that somebody's poking with pins. And then it gets weirder. The people that are actually tending to him in his illness claim that they see shadows that come into the room and a strange black cat that shows up a few times. And the idea that they can sit on the bed and they feel like someone is sitting next to them but they can't see anybody. Then they say a bird comes into the room and starts flying around. You guys get the picture. If you've read anything about witches in Massachusetts or in New England, you get the pattern. They basically accuse her of witchcraft. They say that she's cursing poor Philip and that he's going to die because of her. Here's the problem. She's already been found innocent. You can't put her on trial a second time. Even at this point, they will not allow that to happen, so what are you to do? Well, what they're to do is they get a lynch mob together. They go out to her house, they drag her out, they throw a rope around her neck, they put her on a tree, and they hang her. And then when she's dead, they cut her down, they bury her in a shallow grave, and they go home, job well done. Except for one thing. They forgot to bother to check to see if she was actually dead. She was not. She survived the hanging. She wakes up, digs herself out of her own grave, and drags herself back into the house. Stays in the house for several days, but recovers. Leaves the house and is now seen back in town. Philip is not so lucky. 2 days after this, Philip dies horribly. So swollen and disfigured that they actually talk about how they have to hold his coffin lid and nail it down because they can't keep him in the box otherwise. And she shows back up in a town after this. Can you picture this? No one messed with Mary again ever. She lived another 12 or 13 years, died peacefully in her own bed. No one in town would touch her because they believed she was too powerful. Now, the interesting thing about all of this is, and this was reported on by Cotton Mather's. If you know anything about the witches, you'll know him in a book that he wrote on the doings in New England at the time, because he absolutely believed she was a witch. He thought this was all 100% true. The interesting thing is people in Hadley, Massachusetts still say that they occasionally see an old woman walking up and down Route 9, and if you stop the car, if you're having yourself a little moment of scenery or having a little picnic on the side of the road, she will approach you and ask you for money, and the advice is you always give her something. If you give her something, your day will be excellent. If you say no, maybe not so hot. Let's talk very quickly about Lizzie Borden, one of our most favorite members and most famous members of Massachusetts. She, of course, again, this could be an entire topic just on her and the murder case. I don't want to get heavily into the murder case because that's not really what this is about, but of course, as we all know, she was the prime suspect in the murder of her father and her stepmother. It became a famous nursery rhyme. There's some things that people don't know about this, however. The murders take place on August 4th of 1892. Mr. Borden was known by his family and everyone in town as being extremely cheap and extremely mean. He did not want anyone in his family to have anything that cost him money, including things like you had the ability at this time period to have an ice box and indoor plumbing, and despite the fact that her father was quite wealthy, they had neither. He believed in you absolutely have the bare necessities and that's it. And Lizzie and her sister both hated this. They wanted, not only did they want creature comforts, they wanted to be high society women, and they were ticked off that they had the money, but they weren't allowed to use it. Not too long before the murders, the entire household became very, very ill. Because Mr. Borden was not popular in Fall River whatsoever, his wife, Abby, feared that they were being poisoned by their neighbors, and they were convinced that their neighbors were out to get them. Now, the family doctor said, you have food poisoning, you left the mutton on the stove for 4 days and ate it while it was still on the stove, get an ice box and stop doing that or you're going to get really sick again. And that was the sort of official explanation. There's also a discovery a couple of days before the murders of a cat in the basement of the house that had been mauled pretty badly. Some reporting of it said that it was actually axed to death with a hatchet, much like the Bordens were later on. But there's some debate about that. It's possible that it was attacked by another animal. So we're kind of unsure about that. Lizzie was put on trial for the murders, and most people think she was found guilty, but she was actually acquitted. They couldn't make up their minds. So she walked free, but she was ostracized by her neighbors for the rest of her life. She never got married and died of pneumonia in 1927 and left all of her money, because she didn't have any family, to the local animal society to take care of the animals. So no matter what else she did, she loved her animals. I gotta give her some credit. Of course, the house is now a bed and breakfast. You can go stay there. Many people report any number of different hauntings. People have reported seeing Lizzie on the property. They've also reported seeing Bridget, who was the maid who was in the house when the murders occurred, and discovered the bodies along with Lizzie. There's a very famous photo. I did not put it in here because sometimes people bring kids to this, and I don't want to scare them, but there's a famous, it's one of the first examples of forensic photography, where you can see Mr. Gordon, who was taking a nap on the love seat in the parlor when he was killed. His body is still stretched out where he was sleeping, and there's a cloth covering his face, so you cannot actually see. He was hit in the head about 11 times with the axe. The stepmother, I believe, was 16 or 17. So not quite as many as the nursery rhyme, but still pretty violent. So his face is covered by a cloth, but it's quite blood-stained, and it's a disturbing photo. But it's one of the first examples of forensic photography, and many people in the place that are staying will say that they come into the parlor, which, by the way, looks exactly the same as it did in that photo. They keep it that way for tourists, and they will claim that they see Mr. Gordon's body covered with the cloth, and that when they scream or run out of the room or call people to come down, it will disappear. There are also people that claim that they feel a phantom cat twining around their ankles. I actually have a friend of mine that stayed there overnight who told me that she woke up in the middle of the night, very groggy. You know that moment where you wake up and you forget where you are for a couple of seconds before you finally come to? Well, she is a wonderful cat. We're all cat people. I have 3. She has this wonderful, wonderful big old cat, Max, that likes to sleep on her knees. And she woke up and Max was asleep on her knees. And she was like, Max, get off. And then she goes, wait, I'm at the Lizzie Borden house. Max isn't here, and she turned the light on, and as soon as the light came on, she no longer felt the weight, and there was nothing on her bed. But she swears up and down she thinks that spectral cat was sleeping with her. So all sorts of things happen in this house, according to people that have been there. I have yet to stay there, but I really want to pretty badly. I'm hoping to do it next summer. Let me give you our very last story of the night. We have like 3 minutes left, so I'll do an abridged version of this, but I'd really love to tell this one. I will...
2 minutes if you want.
Okay, well, it's not a terribly long story. I don't do this for any of the others in here, but I will tell you this particular story. I don't think this is real. I think this is folklore. Actually, I think this was a joke or a hoax that got out of control. But it's a great story anyway, so I'd like to end it with it because of how it goes. So the Black Flash of Provincetown starts in 1939, and this is a spook that is first seen on the beach by a young couple. They're having themselves a stroll. He's out with his sweetheart. The moon is out. Everything's perfect. It's a late summer night. You know, you've been there. We've got this idea. And as they come around the dunes, this horrible, tall thing that kind of looks like a man, but is close to 7 feet tall, all dressed in black, with a coat or a cloak that almost looks like wings, and this really deep hat on that's covering half of his face. He comes up, and he comes on these nice 2 people, menacingly, with his wings spread. He leans over both of them, and he growls at them, and they say, as they look under his hat, they can see that his eyes are as red as coal, and they're glowing. And the young woman screams and almost faints and scatters away, and the young man sort of tries to stand his ground, fisticuffs, and then, no, forget it, I'm out of here too. He goes right after her. So they report this to the local sheriff. And then the next day, a hysterical mother shows up with her 3 kids, and she says that her children were playing in an alleyway in town, right in between their buildings. And as they're playing there with their jocks, here comes this huge figure with the wings and the hat and the covering, and he had closed eyes. Oh, but not only was his eyes glowing like coals, but he breathed fire at the children as they were standing there, and they ran away in sheer terror. And here's how it starts. So every few weeks you get someone else, and he's getting bigger and scarier. And now it's not a cloak, it's real bat wings. They've seen horns, they know that there's horns there. And it's not a black hat, it's a cowl, like he comes out of the bowels of hell himself. And so there's a report from a local school teacher who calls on the phone or calls to the local sheriff's department and says, you must come to school. The Black Flash is in the courtyard and he's chasing the children. And all of these cops show up, like a Keystone Cops routine. They all show up and the kids run in the school and they're chasing the Black Flash around the schoolyard. And they shoot at him point blank and it doesn't seem to do anything. He simply leaps over the 9-foot wall that surrounds the schoolyard and runs away into the night. And, into the day, I guess. It would be night. But, so, you get the idea. This keeps snowballing. People are seeing this all over the place. And then, very last sighting. There's a fairly wealthy family that lives on the edge of town and several other, fairly wealthy families. And they have 4 children, 4 young boys, and a girl who's roughly in her very early teens. And the parents decide one night they're going to go next door late and have sort of nighttime socializing, kind of like Great Gatsby-ish kind of stuff. And they're going to have champagne with the neighbors. And they say to the girl, no, you're going to stay here with your brothers. You guys can play your board game or do whatever you need to do. We'll be next door. If you need to, you can either call over for us on the phone, or you can even open the window and yell over. We'll have the windows open, we'll hear you. So they go over to do their thing, and of course the children start playing. And as it gets later and it gets darker, all of a sudden they hear rap, 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 rap on the front door. And the girl's body just goes absolutely cold. She knows something's wrong. So she goes up to the window right next to the door, and she lifts the curtain very quietly, and she peeks through, and there, all 11 feet of him, with his great black wings and his cloven hooves, and his horns and horrible fire in his eyes, there's the black flash, and he's got the door handle, and he's trying to figure out how to get it open. And the young lady steps back, and she knows that she's the only one that can protect her family. If she calls for her family, then the black flash will hear her, and he might try to come in through the window. And if she calls on the phone and they come over, it might hurt her parents as they're coming over to help. So she has to figure out a way to protect her family. So she gathers up her brothers, and they go upstairs to the 2nd floor, and she peeks out of the window in the hallway, and he's right below her. She meets him right at the door. He's still trying to figure out how to get in. So she hides her brothers in the bedroom, and she starts to walk all around the 2nd floor as quick as she can and try to find something, anything, a weapon that she can use to protect her family. The only thing she can find, the maid has gone home for the day, but she was cleaning the bathroom, and she left a nasty bucket of soapy cleaning water in there when she was scrubbing out the bathtub. So not knowing what else to do, our 13-year-old heroine takes the bucket of water, tiptoes back out to that window, leans out and looks, and there he is. He's still, apparently, guys from hell don't know how to open the door. They're still working the door. And she very quietly opens that window up and takes that bucket of water and leans her head out and dumps it all over the black flash of Provincetown. And it screams, this horrible scream that I don't dare even try to imitate with my throat mark still being kind of messed up. And the whole neighborhood hears this like the worst sound you could ever imagine. And he turns and he flees up the street, fire and brimstone in his wake. And he's never ever seen again. The last time they ever see the black flash. Not surprisingly, the year before, The Wizard of Oz becomes MGM's biggest movie of the time. Now, I have said earlier, I believe this is a legend. I don't believe this actually happened. I think either this is a story that just was a story, or maybe that initial couple, or maybe even the first couple of sightings was someone in a black coat just jumping out and scaring people and it got out of hand. However, I love the idea that the ultimate evil was defeated by one brave girl who loved her family so much she was willing to go up against the denizens of hell with only a bucket of water in her hand. And that was so powerful it absolutely overturned evil. That's such a beautiful idea. It's probably not true, but I still want it anyway, and I'm going to hold on to it. I don't care. So I tell you this, my friends. If anything that I have shown you there tonight has left you quaking, if any of these images you find in your head tonight when you lay in bed and stare at the ceiling and you can't sleep, I suggest this. Get up, go into your kitchen, find yourself a bucket. Fill it up with water, take it back and put it by your bed, and I promise you, you're going to feel a little bit better and you'll get a very good night's sleep. Thank you very much, guys.